I'm going to take advantage of this moment while we're waiting for our final panel member to join us to do a plug for the raffle tickets for the NNA. As you no doubt know, after this there is a reception. If you haven't purchased a raffle ticket, it's quite possible you'll be refused service. So you will find someone outside at the end of this session trying to sell you a raffle ticket. This delightful lady here, you can give her as much money as you like and she will give you a raffle ticket or two in return. Thank you. And we are all here. Sorry, Dave. Okay. So this is the Funding Matters plenary. My name's David McIntosh, and like quite a few people here, my route to tobacco harm reduction really comes from the drugs field and to a lesser extent the alcohol world. And while we certainly have funding issues and some considerable debate and disagreement, the numbers just don't really look as big. That's one of the things when I was looking at this. The numbers to do with tobacco are huge. I'm not going to read through all these, but you know, the numbers of smokers, the amount of money, the size of the industry, it's huge. And it impacts on all aspects in terms of product development, government responses, taxation, advocacy, research. I'm also reminded, you know, there's a couple of adages, isn't there? Money makes the world go round, but it's also the root of all evil. If we look at even just the amount that's spent on tobacco control, the numbers again are enormous globally. So we've got an excellent panel here today, many of whom don't really need an introduction, but I'm going to very quickly go through. We've got Clive Bates, who, as many of you will know, has got a fascinating background, both in terms of having formerly been a director of Action Against Smoking for Health, consultancy and advocacy. We've got Roberto Sussman, who brings a very unique to this group scientific background as well as being involved with INCO. We've got Marewa who's got an interesting focus on marginalised groups and brings an awful lot. We've got Moira Gilchrist, who brings an industry perspective, and David Abrams, fresh from his award last night, who brings, you know, a very, very impressive academic background. The way this session is going to work is that all the panel are going to make quite brief opening comments, really, because there is another participant that you can't see up here, and that's you. So once all the panel have had something to say, then it's going to be over to you. There will be an opportunity for a few closing comments at the end, and then you'll be able to buy the raffle tickets. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Moira.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to give at least one member of the industry's view on this. I feel very personally, very strongly about this issue, so I've done something which I don't normally do, which is to prepare some notes, and which I will read from, because I understand as a corporate spokesperson, I actually have a legal responsibility to make sure that what I'm saying is truthful and accurate, and I take that responsibility very seriously. So I want at least 7 minutes of this conversation to feel safe that I'm not going to get the corporation into trouble. So a lot of the anti-industry funding rhetoric that we hear is directed against my company, and perhaps because of the foundation, perhaps because we've invested probably the most heavily in smoke-free products, I don't know, but I'm really grateful that I have the opportunity to give our views. So let me start just perhaps with a few facts. So decades ago, the public health community called on us to produce what they called genuinely less hazardous products. They called for sound scientific evidence to be generated so that smokers could be told about these products and how different they were to cigarettes. We listened as a company and we rose to the challenge. And we went all in. We didn't go in half-heartedly. We had a comprehensive development and assessment program that started just after I joined the company in 2006. We hired scientists like me from the pharmaceutical industry. We invested more than $6 billion during the course of more than a decade. Most of that was allocated to R&D. Tens of thousands of chemical analyses demonstrate that our lead heated tobacco product has significantly lower levels of harmful and potentially harmful chemicals compared with cigarette smoke. More than 20 independent studies so far, including several regulatory and public health agencies in Europe, Japan, and the US, have validated elements of these studies. We completed 18 extensive non-clinical studies and 10 clinical studies. We published our science. We submitted to many regulatory bodies across the world, including the US FDA. They recently authorized the product for sale in the United States, concluding that it is appropriate for the protection of public health. That all sounds good, no? Well, unfortunately, no. Instead, it feels like we've opened Pandora's box. Our investment in the huge body of science that we've generated is condemned by many in tobacco control as worthless PR, not trustworthy. Not because of the quality of the data or the conclusions we've come to, but simply because we funded it. And I'll add that many of these claims are often seem to be made by people who don't seem to have even studied the science that we and others have produced. Organizations like the WHO acknowledge that there are many unanswered questions about tobacco harm reduction. But at the same time, they state that the research needed to answer these questions should not be funded by tobacco companies like mine. They cite that there's a fundamental conflict of interest between the tobacco industry and public health. But I, like many of my colleagues, joined PMI to try and solve a long-standing problem with new solutions that are made possible by advances in technology and science. Weaponizing industry research and promoting a bullying culture among scientists is not consequence-free. Not only does the quality of research suffer, but the real tragedy is in the final result. The billion men and women around the world who smoke today and are being denied truthful and accurate information. They're confused, unable to make informed and better choices. And the result is the status quo is maintained. No one wins. The tradition in science is that research findings must be made public and in sufficient detail that they can be replicated by those who are skeptical. We've done this because we recognize that skepticism is absolutely healthy and normal in science, but it's usually followed by scientific inquiry. If anyone has doubts about the science that we've published and shared with regulators, the scientific method calls for them not to simply dismiss our work, but to try and to prove us wrong with an objective mind and the best available science. But here's the question. Who's going to fund and direct this scientific inquiry? Today, if anyone reviews the independent scientific literature related to harm reduction, some patterns emerge. Controversies are created where no scientific controversy should exist. Remember the popcorn lung scandal, the JAMA letter on heated tobacco emissions. Attention and resources are being diverted to theories that have little or no scientific support, like the gateway theory. Scientific results, including our own, are distorted and misrepresented. There was a special issue of the Tobacco Control Journal recently that focused on this. Qualified and experienced scientists and organizations who do accept funding from tobacco and vaping companies are being vilified. We know from hundreds of discussions with people around the world that there's been a chilling effect on scientists. They fear repercussions for supporting us, never mind if they accept our funding. And this chilling effect has the potential to have a long-lasting and negative impact on progress in addressing one of the world's most pressing public health issues. We're now at the stage of embarking on a huge program of long-term studies that have the potential to answer some of the most pressing questions about tobacco harm reduction. But the effort to discourage scientists and scientific institutions from working with us is continuing, as is the effort to limit our presentation and publication opportunities, the most recent example being SRNT Europe. Actions like these block the rapid progress that we're trying to make and will lock us into continuing to sell cigarettes for longer than we would like. It's time for a new conversation. The narrative of tobacco control hasn't changed for decades, but the companies, the personnel, and the products have. Today's overarching narrative coming from some public health leaders is not one of technology, science, and informed decisions. It's one of war. Much of the criticism of our funding of science comes from individuals and organizations focused on defeating the tobacco industry rather than on providing new solutions to a decades-old problem. To end on a more hopeful note, because remember in the bottom of Pandora's box there was hope, despite these obstacles, our transformation out of cigarettes is a foregone conclusion. We are on a path of no return. The only question is how quickly we can go. Internally, there is absolutely no resistance to continue to fund high-quality science. In fact, over 90% of our R&D spend is dedicated to smoke-free products. The only resistance is external. My hope is that smokers, vapers, heated tobacco and snus users and those who care about them will add their powerful voices to contribute to the debate about whose funding matters and to the creation of risk-proportionate policies and regulation that enable adult smokers to have the opportunity to make better choices.
That's where I put them after. Yeah, we'll be all right. Okay. Oh, good afternoon. And I was told there was no AV, so I've made pictures, being the subversive person I am. So my disclosures, I have never received money from a tobacco company for any of my work or from any vaping company. I did receive some money from pharmaceutical companies over 10 years ago for consultancy work on nicotine replacement products. But I am now, I have a researcher-initiated grant from the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. The Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, as I'm just assuming most of you know, have received a pledge. Philip Morris International funding, a pledge agreement. They've established as an independent charity in the States, United States of America, very strict rules. I looked at all of the documents and I did my due diligence, and I believe that they are independent of the influence of Philip Morris in terms of what they will fund. I've looked at their aims and they align with my own to end smoking in the next generation. I decided to join Derek Yak, who I have great respect for and trust in that vision. So it's been very interesting, my first year, and since the launch of my Centre of Research Excellence in Auckland, New Zealand, and the cyberbullying attacks, the hit pieces being published in journals, and just, you know, the general bullying that I have experienced, and just talking with people, listening to people about their perspectives and their perception of the funding. So I'd like to show you 4 pictures of sort of funding models and the way that people perceive what is good funding, where you should get money from for research, and where you shouldn't. So the first one, now this is a model of clean and pure, morally superior funding. You should get it should fall from the sky. It should run off the mountains, pure, clean, like water. It should run in the rivers, and you just go and scoop it up. And so, you know, in real life that could be, it's money freely given by individuals, by some organisations, to charities, and then they give it out. So that's one model. The pure, now where should we put these? Oh, thank you, Moira. Now, the foundation, I'm going to go kind of to the other extreme here. And no offence to my funders. So I have this model is how people, not me, this is how some people are perceiving the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. So here what we have is industry, and you could apply this to Monsanto, alcohol, gambling. So you have an industry that is deemed evil, that is deemed toxic, and they expel toxic sludge into the waterway, and then everything is going to die. Anything that drinks from that river will die. People, animals, the environment, the whole world is going to end. And some people have gone along and scooping out the water, they're bottling it, and then they're selling it. And they're trying to get people to put in applications for funding for this toxic water. There's nothing you can do. Anything it touches will kill. It cannot be cleaned, ever. So this is the real extreme view of the funding from the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World that I have gathered from, I have gathered from critics. Now, there was a paper back in 2004. This was a proposed model, the Cohen Atoll paper. And really what they said is, if the tobacco industry truly wants to support research funding, then they should give it over to government or independent government managed agency. So that's this model here. So you have the shithouse, Scheisenhausen, and the sewage pond, and then it washes down through the water treatment plant, and out the end comes some nice clean water, and you can use that for your research. So that's that model. Now, where do the critics get their funding from? That's an interesting model. And there is a really fantastic paper by Professor Green in the United States that came out recently. She's in law, and she wrote, anyway, if you want to know about that paper, you can email me. So this is the Health Research Councils, the FDA, NHIS, all the government-run health research bodies and research bodies that give out the funding. This is my perspective now, and Professor Green's model. This is a model of what she calls calculated exploitation. So on the left, we have the farmer growing their vegetables and their fruit and living a life of well-being. And then we tax the shit out of them, and we divert money from them, and that goes down, government water supply, gets all nice and clean and goes through the filter, and then you have nice clean water, and you can feel morally superior that your research is funded by, it's pure funding is behind that. Don't worry about those people who no longer can grow their vegetables and their fruit or feed their children and have really high obesity rates, and we won't worry about them. You've got nice clean water, so you can feel morally superior and go ahead and attack me all you want. And Moira and everybody else who happens to be taking money from the wrong place. So that was my 4 models. It's really to help trigger conversation and interaction this afternoon. The things that I just want to point out are degrees of separation. So whilst some people are not happy to be directly associated with the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, they're okay to take money from me or subcontract for me. I thought that was interesting. So how far away does it need to go? How far down through the water treatment plant before it's okay? I'm not sure what the answer is. And then the other question I'd like to put to you, is there ever a situation where it might be okay for the government or for people to accept we need to take money from the tobacco companies sometime? For example, what about a deadly virus, a new virus we don't know anything about, and it's just spreading like wildfire, and we need a lot of money? Would we take their money then? Thank you.
Thank you. Very hard to follow both of those presentations, which I think are right on target. I'll just want to make a few points. One is, another view of this is that funding doesn't matter at all, nor should it matter. The only thing that matters is how one curates and judges scientific strength, integrity, and rigor. Funding doesn't guarantee that bias doesn't exist. And Sir Francis Bacon in the UK over 400 years ago has a lovely little quote, which I will paraphrase, and the full quote is in our preventive medicine review of the state of harm reduction and nicotine. And in fact, he says, we are all biased, and we have to be very careful of how emotion and irrational thinking color everything we do, and it's inevitable. And so on some level, the funding and how clean or dirty it is perhaps not the issue at all. And the issue may well be how people with so-called clean money can be just as good as misrepresenting and distorting the science, if not better, than those in industry whose lives and their ability to continue to function depends to some degree on how they represent themselves to the public and their credibility. So I think it's incredibly refreshing, although we're still suspicious and skeptical of an industry that in the past has had serious problems. But who are we to know whether the very appropriate statements just made are true or just PR? And on some level, again, I think that's a distraction. If the science is really, really good, and if top scientists, some with perhaps no horse in this race, but from other sources, judge the methodology, the approach, the conclusions as being appropriately cautious about limitations of science and appropriately synthesizing what we know and what we don't know, and how that can either carefully inform policy and information for both individuals, especially smokers, or potential smokers, because I think there's also the case that youth will try risky products, period. They have for millennia. And so we're not just talking about protecting youth and not caring about adult smokers, or caring about adult smokers and not caring about youth. That's another distraction. So it gets back to my main point, which is that it's not so much the funding, it's the integrity of the scientific method and the courage to take the high ground and allow all the science to go through appropriate submission without censorship, serious consideration no matter what the source, and to be judged on its merits using the best tools we have, however limited, in the science. And as a couple of examples, I was the former director of the Office of Behavioral and Social Science at the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And for those of you who don't know, the job description is that I'm the chief spokesperson and interpreter of all of behavioral and social science across the 27 institutes of the NIH that have to do with every disease entity and every health promotion factor that is consistent with the mission of the National Institute of Health, which is to improve the health of the nation, despite the fact that really the National Institute of Health should be relabeled the National Institute of Diseases, and that their funding, although mostly government, also has a foundation that's funded largely by the pharmaceutical industry and cleaned in just the way that Marewa talked about. And all of that is something I'm responsible for interpreting the science to improve the nation's health. And that includes also judging science being done by industry, and no matter where it comes from. And in that capacity, and my 40-plus years of experience as a scientist, I have to say I'm appalled, ashamed, embarrassed, both by the behavior in the United States and by the behavior of societies like SRNT that I am still a member of, in attempting to do what we know is not right, which is to censor, screen, and prejudge based on beliefs and convictions, not on the science. And I think that's appalling, given, for example, the bylaws of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World that are legal and enforceable and have been done extremely well, as Marewa just said, are actually more protective of the freedom of the funders to do and say what they will. And that's intentional. If anything, they bent over backwards, to be sure, because of the known history. And I applaud Derek Yak for having the courage to head the organization, knowing what would happen next. And if you look at the bylaws and governance of the Truth Initiative and the Center for Tobacco-Free Kids, actually there are clauses in there that support censorship and bias. The most obvious one is that the mission of CTFK and SRN and Truth Initiative are clearly stated to protect youth. That inherently says they care more about youth than adults. So that to me is a bias that is more concerning for proper interpretation of science and balance in the interests of the health of the whole population than where the money came from. And I think that's playing out now in some very unfortunate ways, because the stakes now are so high because we actually have viable products that could and will, I believe in time, make combustible smoking obsolete and a thing of the past, but will not eliminate the use of nicotine in society. And some risk has to be taken with teens and young adults, just as we do with alcohol or marijuana or anything else, short of complete prohibition. So to me, the question at hand here is not about funding. It's about social justice, human rights, and being sure that the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, is conveyed as best scientists can, as imperfect as science is, without any impediments of censorship, bias, or preconceived notions that affect what science is done and what the scientists say when they both look at the same data and come to different conclusions. And to me, the only guarantee of moving forward with the whole truth, and therefore telling the public the whole truth about the range of harms and the risks and benefits, is not guaranteed by scientific funding or even lack of funding. It's guaranteed by trying to figure out whether and how badly the inherent preconceived biases that we all have are being managed by the scientists themselves and by peer review and by other august bodies in a completely free and transparent manner where all the data are available to everybody and it can come from any source. And we should have the courage and conviction that our scientific methods and our values will figure out what the strong science is that we might be able to rely on a little bit in informing policy and stop getting distracted by everything else. Thank you.
Right. Good afternoon. This is a very painful issue, and I hope we have a good discussion about it. I want to just lay 5 propositions before you very briefly for, hopefully stimulating the discussion a bit. I'm slightly worried that we're all going to agree with each other violently. So if you can find things to disagree with, please pick those up and come in with disagreement. My first proposition is that the funding issue has been weaponized. It is used for bullying, for intimidation, to exclude, to marginalize, and to suppress findings that are inconvenient to a particular world view. Article 5.3 of the Framework Convention excludes a particular voice, a particular type of insight from the whole conduct of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, it probably has one of the faintest conflicts of interest imaginable, given the way that it's been legally set up. But it too has been excluded on the basis of its funding source. Now, I don't think that is because people are genuinely worried about the conflict of interest. I don't think they want to see the research done that would be done with $80 million a year. Okay, it's more about not having that than it is about understanding any conflicts that are associated with it. And finally, in this area, just with my third example, when it was first discovered by really excellent scientists, and one of them is here amongst us today, that smokeless tobacco was much less risky than smoking, there was a concerted effort to defund those researchers and that research, to marginalize it, to make sure the knowledge was, inconvenient knowledge was never created, and that the only place that those researchers and excellent high quality work could go would be the tobacco industry. And it worked. They were able to essentially delegitimize that science for many years. Not now, thankfully. I think that we're now turning the corner. My second proposition is that Marewa's sparkling spring water from the mountains doesn't find, i.e. virtuous foundations, doesn't find this issue attractive. It's not something that foundations will want to invest in. There's various reasons for that. I think there is little sympathy for smokers, okay, in a way that there perhaps isn't with drug users or HIV sufferers or whatever. I think smokers are an unattractive cause. And that's basically because we, and I include myself in this to some extent, we've vilified smokers and smoking for about the last 40 or 50 years. We've used stigma and marginalization. So something that is about working with them and working in a way that's better for them isn't that attractive. I also think the involvement of the industry is a headache for the clean water money sources. I mean, I really respect what Moira's been doing and her company's been doing, but there's still a huge amount of reputational baggage being carried there. I just think it's hard for those foundations to find their way. So it's hard to access that squeaky clean money. My third proposition is that money plays an enormous role in anti-vaping, anti-THR. in my view, a huge system was built and it still exists to attack the public health problem of smoking. And that originates in the concern about cancer, heart disease, the whole range of tobacco, the burden of health and lost life, the economic damage associated with smoking. Now that machine exists, and I think it's slightly just sort of swiveled around and said, look, something new here, we're just going to blast our firepower at this new thing. And what we do is we're a war machine. This thing that we've built is a war with the tobacco industry, it's a war with smoking, a war with smokers. We're just going to swivel that round, and we're now going to do the same thing with vaping, heated tobacco products, smokeless tobacco, and the rest. Okay, that machine is very heavily powered by money. The research grants, particularly in the United States, particularly the money coming from FDA, with original source from the FDA, looking for reasons to regulate, looking for problems. The philanthropy, the money that's flowing out to groups all over the world now, comes with a particular kind of sort of ideological insight into the tobacco problem. So my fourth point is that conflicts are pervasive. The idea that the only thing that distorts anything in science is money from a business, by whatever route it reaches, is completely ridiculous. There are, I'll come back to the Food and Drug Administration. If you take money from a regulator, your incentive is to find things to regulate, or the money stops. How often do you see FDA-funded researchers say, nothing to see here, don't spend any more money on me? Okay, that never happens. And therefore your incentive, and I would say the whole very low nicotine cigarette thing is basically driven by that kind of conflict of interest. The regulator's interested in doing it, and researchers have found research tasks to do to support it. If you like it, the direction is, rather than evidence informing policy, it's policy informing evidence. I also think, groups like Bloomberg, the idea, you always see people who are funded by Bloomberg, they will never ever say they have a conflict of interest, but they're getting money from, a New York billionaire. Essentially, he's the patron. He has very strong views on public health, and they are the public health views of a New York billionaire. Somebody who may step over a poor person on the way to the opera. They are not really sort of grassroots, coal-face type insights into public health. And he has a very clear set of policy priors, and those are transmitted through the money that he and his foundations spend with groups, and they are conflicted by that. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's something to be transparent about. And then finally, my fifth point is WHO, when it has framework convention meetings, the conference of the parties, it refers to the groups that it allows in as civil society. So it will see groups from every Malaysia, Thailand, Australia, Europeans, Americans, whatever. Those are civil society. They are not civil society. Let me be clear about they are not civil society organizations. They are a very, very unrepresentative group of any society. They're people who often, not always bad people, but they're not representative of society. They're people who are good at getting grants. They're good at being in institutions and foundations. They often have strong policy priors. They'll often follow the policy preferences of whoever is doing the funding. They certainly don't represent ordinary people, and we need to be clear about that. The civil society is not civil society. They are activist organizations. That's my 5 points. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. Yes, I had problems with technology in the previous talk. Boo. Okay. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to this audience. First thing I would like to say is I'm an external scientist. Like, I've been I work on general relativity theory, dark matter, dark energy, cosmological models, observations. I've also worked with off-equilibrium fluids, so on. So I can say something. I've been a beneficiary of public funding. Probably my career wouldn't be the way it is if I hadn't received public funding. I'm working in the National University of Mexico. I've received funding from the university, from the National Council of Research. I've received funding from the European Union also. And yeah, funding is important in science, at least in the scientific activity I do. It's important. Sometimes funding, there is a sort of very interesting interrelation between the disciplines and the direction that research is flowing and the funding. I'm not saying that, for example, there are some people in a smoke-filled room that say, oh, we want to fund this type of research, at least in my area, see? So let's fund this type of research and marginalize the others. We don't have that. There is some, for example, I'll give you a concrete example. In astrophysics, we have a crisis now because we have not detected dark matter. If we don't detect dark matter, then general relativity theory is in serious trouble. Now, finding an alternative gravity theory is much harder than finding dark matter. We would really like dark matter to exist. Please, dark matter, show up, right? So there is a sort of deformation that we see in funding, like, and this happens, for example, in the US. If you want to do numerical simulations and all sorts of numerical paraphernalia, which requires a lot of technique, but not so much, well, it's a special talent. So there is a lot of funding for that. I know because I've had directed PhD thesis and my students go for research and they want to get postdocs. And so if they are postdocs, for example, offer, especially in the US, but not only in the US, if they want to do numerical simulations and observations and all sorts of empirical paraphernalia, there is a lot of jobs. But if they want to find, for example, an alternative gravity theory or some theoretically challenging subject, then there is much less funding. Okay, but this is not deterministic, because if we have a crisis in science, then there will be demand for, like, if we don't find dark matter, there's going to be a lot of demand. Come on, open up funding so we can do theoretical research, because we need it, right? There was an example with superstrings. Superstrings were very fashionable, but they have become sort of an unfalsifiable theory. So there was pressure not to direct so much funding to that, okay? So this is more or less, there is a very interesting relation between the directions of research and funding. And I've suffered that, I've seen that, perhaps not with me because I'm tenured, but with my postdocs and so on. Without postdocs, without younger intervention, then science becomes sterile, right? Now, I come here to the science of tobacco nicotine. And, well, my contribution, where I can contribute as a physicist, is in environmental emissions. Now, environmental emissions, whether from tobacco, from other pollutants, or from electronic cigarettes, it is one of the simplest type of issues here. It is much easier to make an experiment on environmental emissions than an experiment on some biological markers or on stop smoking, on smoking cessation, and these randomized control trials, they are very difficult to make and so on. But this is a very simple issue, right? And there are many controversies here in this field. Some of these controversies have better or worse scientific groundings, but this issue of environmental emissions is one of the issues that could be solved with the data we know now, right? So that's an interesting thing. Now, if you look at the literature you find good papers, bad papers, regular, whatever. And what happens is that it is very difficult to find harms in environmental emissions from some simple chemistry like, and especially that the body absorbs so much, right? So, but you find an issue of deformed risk communication. All these papers report horrible harms, and what you find here, what I have found, it's a sort of self-sustain, it's a flow of literature that one author cites another author, and all of them, not all of them, but there's, I'm talking about tendencies, there are always exceptions, this idea of this risk miscommunication, right? So this has to be related to funding. And it is connected with what Clive said. My conclusion, probably I'm wrong, and this is an issue for debating, is that rather than having the evidence determine a regulatory policy, you have a regulatory policy determining the type of evidence. But here there is something very simple that might not happen with more complex issues in this field. Here, experiments are very simple. You detect, you don't detect. And the design of the experiments are also very easy to see if an experiment is well designed or not. So here they don't detect anything. So they have to really deform the risk communication. And I think this is also connected with funding, because what I've seen with my postdocs, if a young researcher doing this type of studies of emissions knows that if he or she does not report, they are not going to find experimentally the harms. But in their conclusions, they are going to say dangerous, dangerous, particles, 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 right? So it has to be connected with funding. Now, why? Why is this problem? And here I'm going to wrap up, more or less, because what happens with environmental emissions? If we look carefully, cigarettes and tobacco are regulated in a very strict form because of third harm parties, because of harm to third parties. Environmental tobacco smoke, second-hand smoke, see? Now, there is an attempt to equate vaping. There's political reasons that should come in the discussion, and probably Clive and the other speakers are better than me in stating them. There is an interest of some powers that be to equate smoking with vaping, and it would be very difficult to equate them if they don't have this harms to third party argument, right? So this is, and this together with the possibility of taking the simplest type of problem to solve a controversy, there is this issue of, because people will ask, why is this deformation? And funding is involved there, right? So just to finish, this is a very important issue, and there's important policies here, important politics. There's a regulatory policy that has already been decided, right? And then there is commissioned research through funding to support this policy, which is the opposite, the way it should be. Now, one mechanism to solve this, because, okay, I pinpointed the problem, so what's the solution? I don't know, but humbly, I don't know, but my proposal, which is the way we would do it in our field, is to have an external adjudicator. Here we're talking about physics and chemistry. Emissions, it's physics and chemistry. So why not to invite a panel of physicists, physicochemists, and chemists to analyze the whole field, right? But these people has to be external. It's people that must not have any connection with public health, right? Has to be external, completely external, and they should adjudicate and decide whether the recommended policy to ban smoking, to ban vaping indoors with a harms to third party is justified scientifically or not. And this adjudication mechanism, I think it could be effective, and the idea is that it could be effective also for other controversial areas. I think people should consider this. Like, for example, smoking cessation or adolescent or minor usage of, this is demography. It's demographers. It's work. The techniques are social study demography. So why not inviting demographers to check the statistics and to check the things in this type of issues? So that's my proposal. Thank you.
I'm sure you'll agree that was a pretty powerful set of presentations, and it's not every day you get shithouse and dark matter presented to you in the same session. I don't know if we can do anything much about the lights out there, so we're over to you now. People are probably going to have to set off flares or something if I'm going to see who's got questions or statements relating to this. I mean, we've covered a lot of territory there, but I would be really grateful if people have ideas, sort of building on Roberto's in some way, not just about further evidencing the problem, but also any ideas about how we can reduce it. But it is over to you now. And I really hope I can see some hands go up. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know where the microphones are. It's something else I can't see. Oh, microphone's on its way.
Thank you. Is it on?
It is, yes.
Jeannie Cameron from JCRC. My question's to you, Marewa. I've been a long-term admirer of you, and I've seen what happened when you were New Zealand. You were nominated for New Zealander of the Year, and I understand you came runner-up. I was wondering if you could just explain to the audience here who may not be aware of what happened to you, and then my question is broader to the panel. What do you think could be done about the sort of harassment that Marewa had to undergo? Because it's truly horrifying.
Are they going to turn the lights up so we can see people?
Can we turn the lights down? Because up.
So
Yes. Can we do something about the lights?
Because now the audience is the fifth panel, the sixth
Yes, it'd be good
panelists.
to
That's
see
right.
them.
Oh, thank you, Jeannie. Yeah, there's been a few incidences of bullying and defamation, and as I mentioned, a cyberbullying attack. And we do have legislation in New Zealand that bans such things. And so I did ring them and lodge the case. It's and New Zealander of the Year, that was a real surprise and a great boost. I think it was brought to my attention that critics were, they wanted to contact the committee, the Kiwibank committee that runs that award, and try to get them to withdraw that elevation of me to be a finalist of New Zealand of the Year. So I did some Privacy Act requests to actually see if there was anything I could do, anything about legally in terms of the defamation that was going on. And I have an interesting pile of emails. It's been quite good because now I know exactly who is involved. And usual suspects, and that kind of helped, but it's sort of hurtful. I'm aware that other people have been also bullied, there's a lot of exclusionary, and it's that chilling effect as well, trying to work with, say, community groups, and as one of them said to me, we just can't, because of the way people are talking about you, because of they're going to do it to us, so it definitely is having a chilling effect. And the other thing that happened was that these critics, these people running these campaigns, contacted the ethics committees in New Zealand to ensure or to try to corrupt that process and sabotage, so I wouldn't be able to get ethics approvals for any of my studies. And as one of the people said in the email, he was assured by people involved in ethics committees in New Zealand, there's only like 5 national ones, that nobody would give me ethics approval. So that's corruption of the scientific process. Yeah, there's a lot of suppression of science going on using these bullying tactics. It's pretty disgusting.
Does anyone else on the panel want to?
Yeah, some of the reasons I've become a little more aggressive and outspoken, even in my remarks, is because of what happened to Marewa. And coming from apartheid South Africa, I have direct experience with both bullying, censorship, and how those that need the help the most are the last to get it and the last to be thought of by the so-called well-meaning people that have their interests at heart. And I have to be blunt about it because it's gotten very serious. You have to stand up to bullying, and actually other people who are not involved need to stand up for the person who's being bullied and victimized. The person themselves can't do it alone. And I think we, especially scientists, have been so polite and saying we won't stoop to those low, rather frankly unethical and in some ways fraudulent behaviors of scientists who earned the public respect over decades and are still respected and trusted, but have abrogated the trust to cross the line of appropriate behavior and promulgate massive distortions of the evidence, as well as bullying and other ways to discourage strong science in the service of helping understand how to save lives. I don't have a good answer, but I don't think people can just shake their heads, be silent, or somehow be intimidated themselves not to stand up because they know, and as you know from other quotes, you know, first they came for so-and-so and no one spoke up, and then they came for so-and-so, and then they came for you. So I think this is serious, and we're talking about 1 billion smokers' lives. And by the way, we're talking about teens that are going to take risks no matter what we do. It's an absolute myth that we can somehow legislate with policy and other things that we will manage to get no teen to ever try any nicotine product, any more than we can do that for marijuana, alcohol, or other risky behaviors. And so this utopian dream of extremist prohibition in using the rationale that we have such an evil industry from the past that therefore nothing in the present or the future can change that is just ridiculous, and actually smokers lose, and potential smokers, because the truth is being destroyed and suppressed. And you know, people like Marewa and what's happened to her need to be supported and protected, and people need to speak out. It's just not acceptable.
Okay. I'm tempted to go out because now I can see the audience. I can actually see a few people. I have got other questions.
Very quickly, 2 words. Adjudication, external adjudication. Like, if the issue involves, talk to scientists in other areas. Like, this is important because here we are in the middle of the in the middle of the hurricane. There are other people outside, other scientists. It's important to ask for their adjudication.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman next to Harry, in the blue shirt first, I can see.
Alex Werdak from Australia. I agree with almost everything that's been said, and it's a very important issue, but I have some other qualifications. Firstly, I think it's important to recognise that what we're talking about today is not unique to the tobacco control or tobacco harm reduction field. It's unfortunately it's very widespread in science. We can look at the science of climate change and how that's been people who argue that climate change is real have been attacked and vilified unspeakably. And I would argue that that's an even bigger issue than the issue we're talking about today. I'd also argue that we have to recognise that, if you forgive me for saying this, people don't behave irrationally unless there's a good reason. And there is a good reason for the behaviour of the contempt for the tobacco industry, and it's decade after decade after decade of behaviour that was beyond reprehensible. And let's be clear about that. 3/4 of a century ago, in the country we're in at the moment, there was even worse behaviour, and the country that was largely responsible for that had to undergo decade after decade after decade of condemnation, and still does for that period. But what came out of that, personal view, is the unimaginably wonderful behaviour of the current German Chancellor towards 1 million refugees, allowing 1 million refugees. So there was also a great expenditure on reparation, which was part of the resolution of that previous, not resolution, the response to that behaviour. I think the other thing we have to remember is a couple of other things. One is that I say this behaviour in tobacco harm reduction is not unique. Let's look at some other examples. The behaviour of the pharmaceutical industry and the corruption of the medical profession and researchers, which is a very serious problem and one that hasn't been dealt with properly. I take David Abrams' remarks, I think very wise remarks, on board, and particularly the comment you made about implying a weakness in our current measures to deal with the issues of corruption and malpractice within research communities. And that's also part of the problem. And these are very difficult problems to deal with. I think I've been involved in the war against the war on drugs, as has Harry, for many decades. And this is very familiar territory in that conflict.
I don't want to draw you to a close, but...
Okay, so I'll get to the point. The point is that I don't think there is a solution. I think we're going to have to muddle through this, and I'll end with a comment by one of Nixon's economics advisors, Stern, who said that things that can't go on forever don't. And this is one of those things that can't go on forever. And we have to keep on talking about this issue and deal with it as best we can. And I think it's the sort of comments that Clive made the other day about the need for civility on our part and good behaviour and good practice, and ultimately this will get sorted out. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll let Moira come back.
So I absolutely respect what you say, and I think the reason behind this is absolutely the history of the industry. But as an industry representative who joined that industry in 2006, well versed in what had happened and what the allegations were, there's nothing we can do about what happened in the past. There's absolutely nothing. All we can do is ask that people judge us on our behaviours now, and the approach that we've taken now, which is full of scientific integrity, open disclosure, utter transparency, support for regulation, applying through regulatory pathways, and taking great concern that we do not cause the unintended consequences that happened in the past. And that's all I ask of people is don't judge me, don't judge my colleagues about behaviours that happened in the past in a company that does not bear any resemblance to the company I work for today, but judge us on what we're doing today.
I'm going to let Clive have a quick word, because I caught my eye, and then we'll come to you, Harry.
I mean, it will be quick, because I was going to say almost exactly the same thing that Moira's said, but not from in the industry. I mean, the past, I just take it one step further, though. Say, if a hostile attitude to the industry means that we somehow slow down progress in this field, if distrust of the industry means that these products are marginalised or over-regulated, there is a price to pay for that. That's not a price that's paid in the past, that's a price that's paid in the future by smokers not having access to these products or so on. So there are consequences with any action or any approach that we take to this. I think it's true to say the past is not a reliable guide to the future, but it's particularly not a reliable guide in the middle of a technology disruption. Technology disruption is changing everything in this industry. It's changing the companies to varying degrees and at varying speeds, but it is definitely changing the industry. And therefore, we now cannot use the past. We should always be skeptical and mindful, and we should understand the trust issues, but we cannot use the past as a reliable guide to the future of what's happening in the marketplace and the industry supplying consumer nicotine products.
Harry.
Yeah, just briefly wanted to echo actually what Clive just said, that the organisations like the WHO and some of the other organisations mentioned believe they capture the moral high ground by attacking tobacco harm reduction. In fact, it's completely the opposite, because as Clive just said, if they're successful in what they're trying to do, to wipe out the various products that are coming out of THR, then absolutely they've not captured the moral high ground, quite the opposite. But actually what I wanted to say, I'm slightly optimistic in the respect of the way judiciaries around the world have reacted to what's been going on. So, for example, the fact that New Zealand court overturned the ban on PMI heat sticks, the fact that Swiss court has decided that snus is legal. Something's happened in Quebec recently, and I can't quite remember the details. And I also think, and KAC Communications has had a bit of an example of how we have responded to attacks on the organisation with, letters from a learned friend, and put people on the back foot. And you can do that, and you can get apologies and retractions. And I think it's a very small part of all of this, obviously. But I think it's wrong for people to feel that they've got no redress, that they have to sit on their hands and just suck it up, because you can get public apologies, you can get retractions, you can get tweets deleted. It feels small, but I think there are certain people out there who shouldn't feel they can just get away with everything.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to go to Aaron. We'll take a few questions before we come back to the panel, I think.
Yeah, one of the questions I had coming into this whole, observing this, maybe 4 years ago from the outside, coming into this, it's been fascinating to watch, this thing. And I wonder, for the panelists, if there's something about, this scarcity mentality. We talked about a lack of funding, for this, and then all of a sudden I do see, that there is funding starting to happen. And then you see some of that, instead of defense of that, and that support, I've actually noticed a lot of sort of catty behavior. And in some cases people, do you see that sort, you would think that everybody who believed in safer alternatives for people who are using cigarettes would rally for new research and stuff like that. Instead, I've seen almost the opposite, where some people take the opportunity to talk about maybe almost like a righteous attitude of how they have the clean water coming out of there, but they don't have anything. They have a couple drips, and they're bragging about their drips, their clean drips. Any thoughts on that? Has that been moved past, or is that still happening? And if so, what kind of destructive nature is that from people who understand the truth and are still not willing to support new efforts?
Okay, it's a very specific question. Has anyone got a very short, pithy response?
The drips of water. The problem is that, for example, in New Zealand, if you apply for health research funding, it's judged. Who gets the funding is judged by your peers. But what if you are not one of them? So the fact that there's money to get, somewhere else, and a lot more, a river, not just some drips. The drips, and who gets a drip is highly controlled, and they work together. I've been on funding committees. You're supposed to declare your conflicts of interest and leave the room for various reasons. That doesn't happen. And if they don't like someone, you're not going to get funding. So, there's corruption at all levels of, science, and I feel that science is in a crisis.
That sounds like a good point to come in, David.
Just to try a quick comment. I think the bias that Marewa just said is inherent in the system because of peer review. If the culture is anti-harm reduction, and I've experienced this directly, you will not get funded no matter how good your grant proposal is to the NIH or the FDA. And it is biased towards harm detection at any level, because that's the regulator's function, as Clive has said. So I think it is very intimidating, and what I especially have seen, and it's very disheartening, and why I say you have to stand up and call out the bullies and the bias, is that young scientists who I have mentored and supported over the years, and I'm talking 40 years, now come to me in the last 3 or 4 years and say, I'm not sure I want to work with you on this harm reduction analysis or problem because I could be blacklisted and it'll ruin my career and I'll never get a job if my dissertation is focused on a legitimate harm reduction question. Regardless of whether the answer will support or not support harm reduction, I just can't risk doing it. That kind of subtle intimidation is massive and leads to what Clive has said, that in fact the research doesn't get done, even with the FDA putting a so-called $500 million, which is a heck of a lot of research money, into the NIH, which is supposed to have some neutrality and fund investigator research that any investigator can propose and get funded. So there's nothing to stop an investigator saying, why don't we do a trial like Peter Hajek's in the United States to show in a very rigorous way, perhaps that e-cigarettes are double or triple the efficacy of NRT or whatever. Two things. We have $500 million of funding in 13 centers, and almost none of them are looking at that question, which is one of the most pressing and obvious questions. The other reason they're not looking at it is because the FDA has essentially banned doing treatment research with e-cigarettes without something called an IND, because if you want to do a study on smoking cessation, that's a therapeutic indication. And FDA and NIH has still not approved the ability to take an e-cigarette and do a randomized trial of smoking cessation, because you'd first have to get an IND to approve the e-cigarette as a medication, and that hasn't been granted. So there's a reason there are no randomized trials in the USA with tons of money that could have done them. So all of that is insidious about this process, and is both subtle intimidation, but the young scientists I worry about the most, because... What?
Plenty of trials for VLNCs.
Yeah. But so there's just, that's why I said in some level, funding matters hugely in terms of determining what gets looked at. But on the other hand, funding shouldn't predetermine how scientists run their studies and how they conclude and what they say.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can see. No, I'm not going to let you, Roberto. I'm sorry, but you will get a chance to speak again. There's a gentleman at the back in a yellow shirt, and is there anyone over there that's still? I said gentleman. I'll come with you. Was there anyone at the back who's lost somewhere in the glare? I just want to make sure we capture people. No? Okay.
Thank you. Patrick from Swedish Snus Manufacturers Association. And I'm thinking, to what extent is this a scientific problem or a problem for the scientific community, or to what extent is it a political problem?
Okay, I'm going to take another 2 questions, and we're going to wrap up the responses in those with your final comments. That's democracy in action. The gentleman here, it's behind you.
Hi, my name's John Summers. I'm an independent consumer advocate from the UK. I suppose I ought to declare a bit of a potential COI. I'm also a volunteer with the Order of St John, so I have sworn an oath to be truthful and just in all things, and to help the suffering and the needy. Marewa, I'm really appalled that that sort of thing's gone on, and please make that information public, because people need to know who these idiots are. Bullies, I've been the victim of bullying for probably about 20 years out of my life, and the effects are awful, not just on the victim, but also on the person that executes the bullying. They don't realise it at the time, but eventually it comes back and bites them in the backside. But, despite all the good science that's been going on here, somebody actually raised a question in the previous meeting next door, which is we're still using the science of bullying, the language of bullying in the good science that's being done. We're still talking about nicotine addicts, addiction, the evil. When are we going to stop using the language of bullying in science? It has no place.
Thank you. Kevin.
This is a similar question come comments from the gentleman over towards the rear on the left. We focused an awful lot on funding for science, and yes, it's essential. But this is really a hearts and minds issue, and we're just focusing on the minds. And I wonder whether we should be opening that discussion up to what other kinds of funding do we need. That science alone isn't enough. There are other battles we need to win, and just share with people as well something one of your panelists said in an interview preceding GFN, which was along the lines of, when the devil's telling the truth and the angels are lying, who do you believe?
Thank you. Right, now, Roberto, I'm going to let you lead off, and then we'll...
Yes, just a very brief comment. What David mentioned, and Clive, and Marewa and Moira have said, it's true, the funding, after all, look, science, it's a human endeavor. We scientists are as human as the garbage collector or the artist or whatever. So science in all fields are deformations, and funding will be involved in these deformations. It's what I mentioned. There's a lot of funding for superstrings, and suddenly there is complaint that it's undemonstrable, it's unfalsifiable. So in my field, at least in theoretical physics, we do have self-correcting mechanisms. And I believe that is what the field here of tobacco nicotine lacks, is some form of self-correction. It is normal that politics in one country or in another country will deform the science, and the funding will be this weapon that is used in this deformation. Because it's human, we're humans. We are passionate, sometimes we don't think clearly, whatever, and scientists are no exception. But what is sorely missing is a mechanism of self-correction that exists in other disciplines and works well. At least in my field, I've seen it working. Probably not perfect, but it is working. Here we don't have a mechanism. My humble proposal was this external adjudication, which I think it should be tried. I've been trying it modestly among my colleagues, asking them for opinion. And if I talk to a colleague and I show them the emissions and so on, they agree. But if I talk to an oncologist or a doctor, they say that I work for the tobacco companies. So there is sorely needed this self-correcting mechanism, and we should think carefully about it.
Yeah, well, I agree completely, and it's essentially an answer to the first question. Yeah, I mean, there is I mean, I do a review of the stuff coming out in published on PubMed every week, and honestly, it's appalling. I'm not even a scientist, and I can look at this stuff and see the flaws in it. It goes completely uncorrected. It passes into the mainstream, and then it builds up. Then it builds up a body of literature that is endlessly recited and recirculated. So anybody who wants to make a case now, they've got off-the-shelf trail of literature which you can sew together and create a narrative about how harmful these products are, about how much they're encouraging smoking, preventing smoking cessation, and it will look like, superficially, like a credible piece of scientific work with citations from peer-reviewed literature. The problem is the underlying literature is terrible, yet uncorrected and unchallenged. And actually, to be honest, the journals don't like to take challenge. Even if you want to challenge a paper that's been published, you may be allowed a generous, 150 words, maybe 400 in some cases, even though your critique could be extensive. There isn't really a culture of post-publication peer review, and there certainly isn't the kind of publication systems that are used in physics and many other disciplines, in which you publish online and then you just take comments, and the paper is never actually finalized, as I understand it. You just keep having a debate about what's in it, and that sort of thing is completely lacking here. You get your paper published in tobacco control or addiction, I think that's it. It's officially sanctioned true knowledge, which can then be used in future. And it's a giant failing in the scientific system in this field. It is not a genuine inquiring type of way of doing science. It's a way of conferring authority onto a paper, and that's a very different thing to the actual scientific process.
Yes, we welcome controversy, and here controversy is...
I'm going to have to ask our panelists to be quick because I'm getting a strong steer.
I can't add much, but I do think one of the key factors is that there has been strong funding to communicate massive exaggerated harms and to suppress legitimate and omit comparisons with cigarettes, to the point where we have in the United States, for example, 2.8% of the public accurately believing that e-cigarettes are much less harmful than cigarettes. So it's worked. And so to me, some of the correction has to go with something like independent funding or pure water funding, which there's got to be a little pure water somewhere, for a massively supported, and it's not billions, it's a few million a year, to support what I would call, and it's been done in diet and nutrition as well, science in the public interest of the truth in nicotine and tobacco. And that has to have as powerful a voice as Bloomberg has funded this massive initiative to spread misinformation. And to call out the weak science and say there is no equivalence between absolutely methodologically flawed science, some of which is published in top medical journals, because I believe reviewers and editors are in on the bias along with the funding sources. I can't believe some of the studies that have made it into the top journals. The journal editors should be called and ashamed of themselves for letting the kind of science I have never seen in 40 years now get into top journals, when it is so distorted it should never even be published, let alone. And I've rejected some of those manuscripts from, say, JAMA, and they end up in Lancet. So I don't know the full solution, but I think, again, we need a voice of action that can somehow bring science and the rigor of science to judge the good science from the bad science, and call out and show that the stronger science can be used to move things forward, and it clearly supports harm reduction no matter what everybody thinks, because the opposition has succeeded in completely promulgating propaganda with 10% truth, and we all know that that's all it takes. There's a small little piece of truth, as Clive was saying. So I don't know what the full solution is, but I think that's part of it. Scientists also need to think about the impact of their science on people, especially the smokers we're trying to help, and I think we've forgotten that we're all here to help smokers and potential teens who might become smokers to save their lives and nothing else, and we've forgotten that.
The world is changing, and for centuries, maybe hundreds of years, particular groups have enjoyed a life of privilege and have drawn a greater share of resources and protected a greater share of resources for themselves. And around the world, governments are, we have polarization. It is political. There's polarization in many governments, hung governments, and we have the SDG goals, we have greater demand for equity, for women to be recognised as equal citizens in the world. Not just women, but we have the United Nations, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and, saying, stop, trying not to swear, extracting their resources, using them as resources. We have lots of these new declarations and human rights and calls for fairness and fairer taxes and fairer sharing of resource. People are scared. The people who have been enjoying more power over and tobacco control is just an expression of that. Public health is an expression of that. It's all about saying you all need to be white and skinny and ride a cycle. Sorry, David, no, I didn't mean that about David. You all have to be like me. And if you're like me, then you're healthy. If you're like me, then you're well and you're good. And if you're not, you're bad. That's all about determining which group it's okay to draw resources from disproportionately, which group you can use as slave labour in your societies, which groups you can tax more and keep them trapped in a state of poverty. It's all about that. People have issues. People have psychological issues. They have, problems. People have got baggage. And a lot of them work in everywhere, but I think there's a lot in public health where you get to exercise a lot of power and control over people, saying how they should live and what they should do, and you're not like me, and this whole thing about mental health, who's mental and who's not. We're at the end of the day, we're all humans. It's all about survival. We are being subjected to massive manufactured campaigns to keep us living in a state of fear that the world is going to be destroyed. We're destroying the world. We're destroying each other. And someone's going to destroy us. There's massacres. There's shootings. There is a lot of fear. And all of this, it's important. We're trying to save lives. But at the end of the day, and there's a lot of bullying, the power, the language used, it all comes back to who's trying to hold on to the resources for themselves and their families so they can be safe and they can have more and they can fly in jets and have more and more and more and gated communities. If we get all fair and, share everything out, it's not going to be like that. And who's going to clean the toilet,
There's a theme emerging in some of what you've done.
So I'll be super short. I think something just popped into my head as everyone was talking. There's a famous quote from Maya Angelou, which I will not be able to recall correctly, so I just paraphrase, but it goes along the lines of, don't expect somebody to defend you if you're not defending yourself. If you do defend yourself, you'll be amazed how quickly people will come running to help you. And I think that's what we have to have now as an approach. We should be rigorously all defending ourselves, calling out the nonsense when we see it, and supporting each other to do it. It's all very nice that we all agree here, but we actually have to go and move into action.
Okay, there may be a slide. Last slide, which I'm summing up now anyway. But I'm sure that a lot of this conversation can continue later. we might not have the slide, but really it's going to end with a big number that's been mentioned, is, you know, this isn't an abstract concept. There is, you know, it's about the 1.6 billion smokers that we shortly will be facing, and what could be done to stop premature death and illness. And it's a very real thing. And one of the things that did strike me earlier when David was talking about youth, and this actually one of the worst things that can happen to a young person is their parent dying prematurely. And I wonder where that occurs in some of the thought that goes on there. Some of the things I've heard, you know, scientific rigour, that's something we can support. There's a big thing about forming alliances, both internally, so perhaps less criticism of different aspects of tobacco harm reduction, but also external alliances have a lot to offer as well. And there is obviously that point about defending ourselves might actually help with some of that building of alliances. I just want to end by asking you to join me thanking the panel. I am sure that there was much of what's been discussed in the last hour and a half that will stay with you for a long while. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Can I just plug the session tomorrow afternoon? If you didn't get to ask your question today, there's an open debate session which I will be chairing and facilitating. We've got a very mouthy, opinionated panel. So if you didn't get to make your point today, come along and make it tomorrow. Okay, it's going to be the second to last session in the event.